that?
Yep, so every presentation will be posted, both the recording and the PDF of the recording or the PDF of the PowerPoint is posted to Canvas under modules.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep.
I have a request as well regarding of that. Could you like report? I mean, could you post it like before class started, like ahead, so we can prepare? At least we can read. Since you said that you gotta contribute to the lectures and to the topic, so it's better to us, you know, to understand and know better the topic before we start.
Yeah,
That's
I
it.
could do that.
Thank you.
Most days at least. Sometimes for whatever reason, sometimes I decide to make changes to a lecture like last minute, and it might not be ready before
Oh,
class.
okay.
But a lot of
I
times,
mean, yeah, because you said last meeting you said that we get, you know, it's gonna affect our grades if we not contribute, and it's better for us to like at least know what we're talking about, what we're gonna talk about. So yeah.
Yeah, I can post it whenever they're available ahead of time. I'll post those. But I don't want anyone using that as a substitute for showing up for class, because there's a lot of stuff that there's a lot of stuff we talk about that isn't actually like literally written out on the slides. So
okay, cool.
Any other questions? All right, so let me share my screen and we'll jump in. All right, so lecture 1A. So this is fundamentals of ecology. And so today we'll be talking about sort of basic ecological principles. You may be thinking like, wait, why did he leave the word landscape out of there? And that was done intentionally because we are not yet talking about landscape ecology specifically. We need to review some sort of basic principles of ecology first, so that you understand those. They should be, a lot of it should be familiar already from past classes that you've taken. But if not, this is a good opportunity to get up to speed with some of that information. And everything we'll be covering in these fundamentals of ecology are principles that you sort of need to understand for the larger landscape ecology principles to make sense. All right, so first we'll begin with some definitions of words that are commonly used when talking about ecology. So the first one is environment. And ecology and environment are often confused by people as sort of being the same thing, and they are not the same thing. So first, I'd like to start by clearing that up. So environment is defined as the circumstances, objects, or conditions by which one is surrounded, right? It's basically your physical surroundings. Secondary definitions of environment include the complex of physical, chemical, and biotic factors such as climate, soil, and living things that act upon an organism or an ecological community and ultimately determine its form and survival. And then finally, the aggregate of social and cultural conditions that influence the life of an individual or community. Right? So in short, it's basically the mix of living and non-living things in one's, sorry, I lost my place. So yeah, it's a mix of living and non-living things in your surroundings. And in common parlance, most people would understand the word environment to basically mean this: either the natural environment, which is what most people associate the word environment with. But that word can also refer to something like this. This is a built environment, right? This is the human environment that we live in. So environment can refer to both of those things. It's just anything that surrounds you that influences your life and the life of the larger population. And then next we have ecology. So ecology, on the other hand, is defined as the branch of biology that deals with the relations of organisms to one another and to their physical environment. Right, so it's the relationships between different organisms and their environment. So here we have an example of organisms, right? We have frogs and we have dragonflies and some other insects living under the water there, and some snails and so forth, right? And they're living in an environment that consists of water and plants and soil and other factors. And the relationships between that those different organisms have with each other and the relationships that they have with that physical environment, all of that together, the study of that is ecology. All right, next, let's look at ecosystem. So an ecosystem is a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. So ecology is the study of the relationships between all those things. And then the ecosystem is basically that, think of it as like a bucket that contains the environment and then all of the organisms that live in it. It's not specific to one species within that environment. It's about all of the different species that live within that physical environment. Right, so here's an example of an ecosystem. What kind of ecosystem is this?
Marine.
Marine, sorry.
Yes, marine, which is saltwater, right? So this is a coral reef ecosystem, and we have different varieties of fish, we have different varieties of coral, and all of those organisms living together in that physical environment is makes up that coral reef ecosystem. Next word is community. So community generally means a group of people having common history or common social, economic, and political interests. That's if you look up the dictionary definition. Biologically speaking, it's a group of or association of populations of two or more different species occupying the same geographical area at the same time.
So could humans and the bacteria that live inside us be a community?
Absolutely. Because we're both occupying the same geographical area at the same time. Right? So if you have, let's say that you're looking at a specific kind of wetland and you're thinking about the plants that live in that wetland, you might have different varieties, different species, different varieties of plants. All of those different species of plants together make up the plant community of that wetland. Right? So here's a wetland plant community. It's not just one species. There's multiple species. There's trees, there's shrubs, there's perennials and grasses. And all of those different plants together make up the community, and also the insects and animals that live there as well. But if we're specifically talking about a plant community, then that would just be the plant species that live in that environment. Next is population. So generally speaking, the population is the whole number of people or inhabitants in a country or region. Again, that's kind of the dictionary definition. When we apply that idea to biology, it's all of the organisms of the same group or species which live in a particular geographical area and have the capability of interbreeding. Right? So that generally means same species in most cases. Right? So if you have honeybees and you have raccoons, those are not a population because honeybees and raccoons cannot interbreed with each other. If they could, we'd have some really terrifying animals on the planet. So each specific species, so the honeybees are one population, the raccoons are a separate population. And here we have our honeybees, and honeybee population decline is something that's been talked about a lot in the news over the last few years because it's a concern that really worldwide in terms of pollinator populations, and specifically honeybees have been under threat. So when they talk about population, they're specifically talking about species of honeybee and how their numbers are declining. Next, we have organism, right? So an organism is an individual animal, plant, or single-celled life form. And in other words, it's basically any living thing, but it's one instance of that living thing. It's not a group of them. This is an example of an organism. This is a tardigrade. It's a badass little animal, actually. It's less than 1 millimeter long, and it's usually found living in moss, which is why it gets its common name as moss piglet or water bear. It's got the most adorable names ever, but it's actually a really super tough little creature. So tardigrades can actually, sorry, was someone saying something?
I just said it's chubby though.
Chabido?
No, chubby.
Oh, chubby, yes. Yeah. And so the interesting thing about tardigrades, they can survive temperatures as high as 150 degrees Celsius. That's higher than boiling water. So you can have these guys in a pot of water and boil them up and they'll be just fine. They've also been found surviving temperatures as low as minus 200 degrees Celsius, which is close to absolute zero. They can survive without water for decades. Like you can dry them up, have no water whatsoever for like, 20, 30 years. And then you add some water to their environment and they kind of puff back up and go about their day like nothing ever happened. They can also survive the crushing pressure at the deepest point in the ocean and survive the vacuum of space, right? So no oxygen, intense radiation, extreme cold. They are insanely interesting little creatures. And actually, I have a quick little video here because they're just so fascinating. It tells you a little bit more about tardigrades. Yeah.
Is this like the Water Bears theme song?
It is. There, yeah.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
Let's close that.
Are those things just everywhere, or?
Pretty much. So but the most common place they're found is in moss. And that's where they prefer to live, but there've been, like that video just said, a new species was found in a parking lot in Japan. And they live just about anywhere, and they're just kind of crazy, tough, but adorable at the same time. So
Do you think they're in like drinking water?
that's an excellent question, because it seems like they can survive anything. So I would think that if they got into the water supply, that nothing that they did to treat the water would kill them necessarily. So that's we might be drinking them all the time. I have no idea. Pretty cool.
Do they
Though.
do anything for the moss or water or anything? Like, is there a ecological purpose for them, or are they just kind of chilling?
That is also a good question. I'm not sure what they like eat or anything. I haven't done a huge amount of research into them. I was just like fascinated by the fact that they like can survive all these extremes. But it would be kind of interesting to sort of know what their little ecological niche is. I'm sure that they serve some purpose in that particular ecosystem. So, all right, moving on. Species. So what is a species? It's a category of biological classification ranking immediately below the genus or subgenus, comprising related organisms or populations potentially capable of interbreeding and being designated by a Latin binomial. So when we say Latin binomial, that's the genus and species that we use in Latin to refer to them, like Acer rubrum, which is?
Maple?
What kind of maple?
Is it just red maple?
Red?
Yes, red maple, correct. So that is a species. And species can more simply be described as a class of individuals having common attributes and designated by a common name or a group of living organisms consisting of similar individuals capable of exchanging genes or interbreeding and or producing viable fertile offspring, right? So there's that kind of interbreeding definition again, that scientists use that a lot to determine sort of what organisms belong together in the same group. And in this case, that is one of the definitions of what constitutes a species. Right? These are all maple leaves, by the way. And there are a dozen different species of maple trees that are indigenous to North America. So they're all maples, but they are different species of maples. So even though they're all maples, they can't interbreed with each other. Red maples can interbreed with red maples, and silver maples can interbreed with silver maples, and so forth. But a silver maple and a red maple can't naturally interbreed with each other. All right, next term is niche. So a niche is defined again in the dictionary as a shallow recess, especially one in a wall to display a statue or other ornament. And this word is applied to biology to mean the functional position and role that a species plays within an ecosystem, or basically its job in that ecosystem. Or a habitat supplying the specific factors necessary for the existence of an organism or species. Right, so if we look at an example, this is a dung beetle. And this dung beetle is an example of an organism that occupies a very specific niche in its ecosystem. Look how perfectly round they get those turd balls. Pretty impressive. They are little sculptors of turd. Right, but
Do they live in the ball or do they just cover the hole with the ball? I forgot.
that is another good question. These are
I don't think they live in it.
I don't think they live in it either.
So I just
I
read.
think they get their resources from, like, they eat the sort of undigested leftover bits of food that are in the dung, is my understanding.
So I just read that you do eat tardigrades like all the time.
Oh, sweet. So we're all like, each of us is like a walking, breathing tardigrade environment.
Actually, there's no.
Yeah, I don't know about water, but
I just have
what I read, it said a lot in like lettuce and stuff.
communicate with the foreigner people.
Yeah.
And to show their thinking.
Somebody
Um,
somebody needs to mute their mic.
it will be better than
I'm guessing it's
Yeah,
Yen
no.
Rong.
Your
Right.
mic is on.
yeah, just
I will mute her. There we go. I like having that power. All right. So that is a niche, right? So again, it's that specific sort of job that a particular organism has within the environment, or it's the specific conditions within which an organism lives. Next, we have habitat. And habitat is the type of natural environment in which a particular species of organism lives, or the natural dwelling place of an organism. Right, so the savanna surrounding Mount Kilimanjaro is the natural habitat of African elephants as their habitat. All right, so any questions about any of the definitions we went through before we move forward?
Can you go back to that slide for
Sure.
a second?
And when you have your first exam in late February, you'll be expected to understand and know and distinguish all of these different terms. All right, we good?
I'm good.
All right. So next, don't know much about ecology. So let's look at some ecological principles. And first we'll start again with that definition. Ecology is the branch of biology dealing with the relations and interactions between organisms and their environment, including other organisms. Right? So those interactions determine the distribution and the abundance of organisms. So how many of them there are and where they can be found within that environment. And it's not just the environment that impacts organisms, but also it works the other way around. Organisms impact the environment. So here's a direct impact that an organism might have on its environment. So this is a beaver dam, and who knows what beaver dams do to an environment, or what beavers do to an environment in general? Because they're little engineers that drastically change the environment that they live in.
Well, they flood it.
They flood it, yeah. So they build a dam along a river or stream, and they tend to flood that place and create a little pond for themselves.
Do they cut the tree? I mean, like
They sure do.
Okay.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
little carpenters.
They are. And in fact, yeah, so they have those big tough teeth that in fact they have to be chewing on wood all the time, or the teeth kind of outgrow their bodies and can basically, mess them up pretty badly. So they need to be chewing on wood all the time to keep their teeth in check. And so not only do they flood their environment by damming up streams, but in the process of cutting down those trees to flood that, to create that dam, they're also sort of agents of deforestation, you can say. They change areas from forests into meadows or fields surrounding those lakes that they create. So they have a huge impact on their environment.
Do you know typically how long it would take for them to chew through one generic tree, like 10-inch trunk tree?
They're pretty quick about it. Like they take down trees pretty quick. I mean, I don't know the exact time that it takes, but they can, they can build a dam typically in like a matter of like a few days to a week. So, and think about the number of trees that they have to cut down to do that. So they're working pretty quickly.
Yeah, we used to have a beaver living right by our place on the river,
Mhm.
and we would watch it take down like a 20-inch trunk in like an hour. Just gnawing at it, he would take down the whole tree.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy like how efficient they are.
So what is the advantage of them creating that dam to the environment? Is there any specific thing that they really help the environment or the ecosystem in the area?
Well, it's not. It actually creates an entirely new ecosystem for other species. So the beavers are doing it. So the beavers, like the dam that they create, they typically like live within that dam. So it creates an environment for them to live in. And then it also like traps like all kinds of plant material and whatnot that's coming down the river that they can use for nutrition. And then, but it also creates like an entirely new, like a lot of wetlands, for example, started out as, basically just streams going through an area that beavers dammed up and created kind of a larger flooded area. And then you have all sorts of different other species that can survive in that particular habitat. So it actually is by the beavers kind of creating something that works for their specific needs, it creates an environment that works for the needs of a whole host of other organisms as well.
It makes good structure for fish to live in too.
Yeah, exactly.
Whenever I
So-
go fish, hit the dam.
Yeah, so fish and other freshwater animals will also live in those dams as well. Absolutely. So another example of organisms influencing their environment can also be indirect, right? So beavers are a very direct example of that, where they are changing, they're coming in and they're being carpenters and engineers, and they are physically changing the environment through their direct actions. But there are also indirect impacts known as trophic cascades, whereby introducing a top level predator can actually change the physical environment. So trophic cascade is an ecological phenomenon that's okay. Some people are not muted here. There we go. A trophic cascade is an ecological phenomenon triggered by the addition or removal of top predators and involving reciprocal changes in the relative populations of predator and prey throughout the food chain, which often results in dramatic changes in ecosystem structure and nutrient cycling. Right, so that's basically looking at all of the different populations, are basically looking at the animal community, let's say, in a specific environment, and either adding in or taking out a top level predator. And it has ripple reactions all the way down the chain, and in fact, ends up influencing the physical environment. And you might be thinking like, how could, for example, here's an example. So how wolves change rivers. And there's a little film we'll watch about this that's narrated by a breathlessly excited British dude. But it's a very interesting example of how just introducing a top level predator can change the actual physical environment.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. But the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park. And despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately, those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed in it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. Here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Oops. So pretty amazing, right? That that a single species like that can have this incredibly dramatic impact on the entire ecosystem. And there's one more example of this that deals with Tasmanian devils. So look at that one. Whoops. Here we go.
Scott, have you heard of the wolf reintroduction to Rocky Mountain National?
I heard they were planning to do it, but I hadn't read in a recent update about whether, have they started it yet?
Well, the legislation passed, so that was
Right.
that was the big thing that they had to jump over, and then now they're working on how to get them, where to get them from, and how to get them reintroduced.
Yeah, and that kind of thing usually faces pretty stiff opposition from ranchers because they're concerned about their herds, obviously.
Yeah, especially in Colorado, it's pretty, there's big stigma.
Yeah. But you know, when you see all the benefits they have for the ecosystem, it's kind of like just amazing to think how one species can have such a huge impact on the entire ecosystem and the populations of all the different species in that chain. So this one's pretty interesting because this one has to do with Tasmanian devils and forest fire, actually. So let's watch this one also.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. Many of us would likely be astonished to learn that Tasmanian devils were never unique to Australia's island state of Tasmania as they are today, but rather evolved over millions of years on mainland Australia, where they played a vital role as a keystone species that helped maintain the health of entire forest ecosystems. Prior to European arrival, Australia's ecosystem evolved in near isolation from the rest of the world for over 40 million years, forming deep, complex interrelationships that help maintain ecosystem resilience. However, foxes and cats, introduced in the first 100 years of British arrival, quickly ate their way across the continent, growing in numbers. Fueled by a vast European rabbit population, which had been destroying the vegetation undergrowth that was essential to providing shelter to small mammals like bandicoots, bettongs, and potoroos. It turns out that these small mammals are essential to maintaining the health of ecosystems. As these animals forage for food, they dig the ground, mixing organic matter into the soil and spreading fungi and seed. The burying of leaf litter reduces fuel loads, creating conditions for cooler, less destructive bushfires. Larger mammals, like the wallabies and kangaroos, while often spared from the jaws of cats and foxes, became overabundant, and in the absence of native predators, further added to the loss of vegetation cover. In studying Tasmanian ecosystems, we have learned that the very presence of Tasmanian devils changed the behaviour of the other animals in the ecosystem. Cats tend to avoid areas with healthy populations of Tasmanian devils, which allows small native mammals to survive in the landscape and perform their role as ecosystem engineers. By reintroducing devils, animals like wallabies and possums might recognise the Tasmanian devil as a species to avoid, helping to reduce grazing pressure on ground cover by pushing possums back into the trees and some of our wallaby species deeper into the forests. As ground vegetation is restored and cats find it more difficult to function, opportunities for small mammals to find a place to live and hide from predators will increase. While not yet tested, modelling suggests the effect of devils on foxes may be similar to those on cats. The bandicoots, bettongs and potoroos will return to the forest floor, helping the forests to regenerate and helping mitigate the impact of devastating bushfires. With cooler bushfires, pockets of habitat might remain unburnt, providing further safe havens for wildlife and increasing ecosystem resilience to future threats. By returning the Tasmanian devil, we may be able to help heal our forests.
So another cool example of how a specific species can actually have an impact on the intensity and frequency of wildfires, which you wouldn't think would necessarily be connected to the organisms living in that place. So the more that we learn about ecosystems, the more we learn that like every single species in that ecosystem has an impact on every other species there. And that removing one of those, even a top level predator that you would think wouldn't necessarily impact anything else, actually has a huge impact on those species and then the physical environment. So pretty fascinating way of thinking about how those populations affect their physical environment.
They just reintroduced the Tasmanian devil to the mainland in Australia.
That's my understanding, or they were at least in the process of doing so. I don't know the specifics of that program, but it's kind of similar to the reintroduction of wolves that we're dealing with over here. Is that they're trying to reintroduce those Tasmanian devils to mainland Australia.
Yeah, I think they put them there now, so
Okay,
we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. So some of the main themes of ecology that we will be talking about is: where do organisms live and why? How many organisms are present and why? How do their distributions and interactions change over time and why? And what are the factors that contribute to ecosystem change over time? Right, so these are kind of some of the big questions that ecologists deal with. So where organisms live and why, how many there are. Like, so if we talk about specific populations or communities, what is it that affects the numbers of the organisms there? How do where they live change over time? Like, why do organisms like not necessarily stay in the same area for a certain amount of time, but they tend to move around? And then what are the factors that contribute to that change? Right? Why do ecosystems change over time? Why are they not kind of a stable system? And when we talk about ecology, we sort of necessarily have to also talk about evolutionary biology, because they're both very closely related sciences rather. So events that occur in the framework of ecological time, meaning minutes, days, or years, translate into effects over evolutionary time, which is decades or millennia, right? So these small sort of day-to-day changes that we might see in the behavior of animals or numbers in populations of species, over time, that can have an evolutionary impact where the actual the actual sort of biology of those different animals and plants tends to change. So one example is hawks feeding on mice can impact mouse populations and eventually lead to natural selection of mice that have camouflaged fur, right? So if you think about basic evolutionary principles, the idea is about natural selection. So the hawks are mostly feeding on the mice are the easiest to find, right? Those are the ones that get eaten first. The ones that blend in with their environment more are the ones that tend to survive longer and reproduce. And over time, that leads to a population of mice where they all tend to have this camouflage fur that blends in with their environment, right? So the behavior of the animals and the sort of small day-to-day changes within that environment can lead to long-term evolutionary changes. So when we talk about ecological research, it can be done on a number of different scales, and it ranges from individuals all the way up to the biosphere. And each one of these branches of ecology has a name to indicate what level of scale it deals with. So when we look at organismal ecology, it's concerned about the way in which an individual interacts with its environment, right? One specific individual organism and how it interacts with its environment. So that's organismal ecology. Next up from that, we have population ecology. So that's a study of a group of individuals of the same species and their interactions with other species and with their environment. Next is community ecology, because as we learned, a community has many different populations within it, right? Because there are different species interacting with each other. So community ecology deals with all the interacting species within a particular ecosystem. Next is ecosystem ecology, and that deals with the interactions among all abiotic factors and all organisms that exist in a certain area. So what am I referring to when I mention abiotic factors?
The non-living things like the ground.
Yeah, rocks, soil, water, chemicals, nutrients, all of the different sort of non-living aspects of the environment are the abiotic factors. The next is landscape ecology. There's the scale, the level that we will be focused on this semester. And that's concerned with patterns and interactions among ecosystems and human development, right? So we're not talking about necessarily just one specific ecosystem with landscape ecology. We're talking about interactions among different ecosystems over large areas of land. Then there's global ecology, which is a study of events and forces that shape the biosphere, which is basically the global ecosystem. And this deals with topics such as climate change, right? So climate change obviously is a hot topic, no pun intended, in the study of global ecology, because that's impacting ecosystems and organisms and populations worldwide. So, for example, if we wanted to look at population ecology, we might study where kangaroo numbers are greatest across Australia and try to understand the environmental reasons for why you have differing density of distribution across the continent, right? So that might be one aspect of what you might study if you're looking at population ecology. You just got to love the names that Australians give to their wildlife, right? Like that's the only place where you find animals that are called things like kangaroos and bandicoots and potoroos and wallabies. They're just like, they have the most creative names for their wildlife. All right, part 3 of this lecture is talking about species distribution. Right, so species distribution, and again, to remind you, species distribution is where you're finding these species, where are they located in the environment, is determined by the species niche. And there are 2 types of niches that we need to talk about when we're talking about species distribution. The first is the fundamental niche. So the fundamental niche is the entire set of conditions under which an organism can survive and reproduce. So that's basically where it can live, where all of the conditions, so, you know, it's got the right amount of moisture and it's got the right trees and it's got the right soils and all the different factors that a specific animal needs to be able to live are present in that place. So that's the fundamental niche. However, the place where the animals actually live is known as a realized niche. So the realized niche is the set of conditions that are actually used by a given organism after interactions with other species are taken into account, right? So even though maybe mice can live in the entirety of a forest, you might find their populations only in one specific area because owls and hawks can't they don't frequent that area for whatever reason. And so the populations of the small rodents tend to congregate in that area because it's safer from the predators. Right? So fundamental niche is like basically anywhere that an animal is capable of, or a plant is capable of living. And then realized niche is where it actually lives because of its interactions with other species. Does that make sense? That distinction? Okay. So what are some of the factors that cause species to be absent from a portion of their fundamental niche? Right, so I mentioned one already, right? So we have some examples here. So species is absent because of dispersal, right? So we want to ask, like, is it dispersal? Are they moving to different parts of that fundamental niche? If the answer is yes, then that might mean that the area is inaccessible or there's insufficient time for those animals to move throughout that environment. If the answer is no, they're not dispersing, then it could be because of behavior, right? So if it's because of behavior, it means that those animals are making a selection about what habitat they prefer over others. So there might be a habitat, even though they can live in lots of different parts of that environment, there might be one specific habitat that better suits them than others. If the answer to that is no, then it could be biotic factors. So other species, in other words. And so if other species are impacting them, that could be effects of predation, parasitism. So parasites or other kinds of organisms are basically microbiotic that are creating basically disease or negative influence that's lowering the number of animals in that area. It could be competition with other species, right? So sometimes you have two different species that need the same resources. And if the competition is too fierce, then one of those species is going to decline in population. And then there could also be disease. So those are biotic factors that might influence animals to not inhabit their entire fundamental niche. If it's not biotic factors, then the last option is that it could be abiotic factors. Right. And when you look at abiotic factors, you have physical factors and you have chemical factors. So the chemical factors have to do with water, oxygen, salinity, pH, soil, nutrients, etc. So these are sort of chemical aspects of the environment that may influence where that species lives. And then physical factors like temperature, light, soil, structure, fire. So you can have these kind of big destructive events that might influence the physical environment. Moisture, etc. Right? So all of these things can have impacts on where species will live within their fundamental niche. And that's what determines the boundaries of their realized niche, which is where they actually live within that environment. Any questions about that? All right. So species dispersal contributes to the distribution of organisms, right? So when we're talking about species dispersal, we're talking about species moving around in the environment and not just staying in one location. So dispersal refers to the process of distribution of individuals within geographic population boundaries. So how are those individuals moving around in that environment? So a question that you might ask when you're looking at dispersal is the distribution of a species limited by dispersal, meaning by movement of the organism? Right, and obviously it depends on the type of organism you're looking at. If you're looking at birds, they're much less limited by dispersal than maybe oak trees are, right? Oak trees are reliant on other species to disperse. They have to be, the acorns have to be picked up by other species and then buried somewhere else, and then they grow into new oak trees. So that's how oak trees disperse. But animals that have their own locomotion obviously have much more control over where and how they disperse. And so the answer to that question that we just posed can be obtained by transplant experiments. Right? So if the transplant, meaning that you take an animal or a number of organisms, and you move them out of their realized niche into another portion of their fundamental niche. And if that transplant is successful, then that generally means that the organisms just haven't reached that target area yet, right? So if they're able to survive in the area they were transplanted to, it means that that area could be part of their realized niche, but they just haven't gotten there yet for whatever reason. If the transplant is not successful, that means that there are other factors that are limiting the distribution of the organisms, such as competition, lack of a food source, some of the other factors that we looked at when we were talking about distribution. Right, so here's sort of a diagram showing that, where you have the actual or realized niche of a species, and then you might try transplanting them. So here you have transplants that are successful, meaning that that area can be considered part of the realized niche of that organism. And any place where it's not successful would be, it's still part of the fundamental niche, but it's not part of the realized niche because the animals don't do well there, or plants don't do well there because of some other factors in the environment that's limiting them from flourishing there. And then there's something known as the competitive exclusion principle. So this has to do with competition between species. And what that states is that if two species with the same niche coexist in the same ecosystem, then one will be excluded from the community due to intense competition. Right? So this is talking about two species that basically need all of the exact same resources. And when you have that condition, one of them is going to be outcompeted and won't, and generally won't show up in that specific environment or ecosystem. Right, so let's look at some examples of how different niches can.
Sorry, can you go back real quick?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So sort of the easiest relationship to understand with niches is when you have separate niches, right? So species A has its niche and species B has its niche. And again, just to remind you, the niche are the specific kind of conditions that that species needs to survive and thrive, right? So they can be in the same physical environment, but not share the same niche, right? So for example, let's take a forest, right? A forest is one physical environment or ecosystem. And within that ecosystem, you might have worms that are living down in the soil, and they have their own niche. And then you have birds living up in the trees, and they have their own niche. And even though the birds might eat the worms, in terms of the resources that each group needs to survive, they're separate, even though they're in the same environment. So those are two separate niches. So there's no overlap between those niches, meaning that coexistence of those species is possible. You can have both species living within that same ecosystem. Sometimes, though, you have overlapping niches, right? So you have the niche of species A, and then you have a niche of species B, and there's some overlap between them. So what might be an example of an overlap in species, or what kind of condition could create an overlap in those niches? What are we talking about when we're talking about a partial overlap?
Maybe like two predators with the same prey.
It can be two predators with the same prey, exactly. But if it's a partial overlap, it means that maybe species A eats mammals and birds, and species B only eats mammals. And so the overlap occurs in the place where, or let's say species B eats mammals and fish, right? So the part of overlap is like the mammals. That's the prey that they're both trying to compete for. So it's only a partial overlap. So there's going to be interspecific competition that will occur where those niches overlap. it doesn't necessarily mean that those two species can't coexist because they have other food sources. But they're going to tend to, one of them is probably going to outcompete the other for that specific area of overlap of those niches.
So would that be like the bears and the wolves? Because they both technically eat, like, I guess, the deer, but.
Yeah, they're both predators. And so, and actually the bears technically don't eat those larger prey like the wolves do. The bears are usually eating like fish and smaller prey like that. So actually, in that case, they don't necessarily compete for the same.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Bears will more scavenge for the deer stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So what happens when you have two species that have a partial overlap, or their niches have a partial overlap, is that they will tend to specialize to avoid that competition, right? Because it benefits your species if you can like have as little competition with other species as possible. It means that you get all the resources to yourself, right? So if we have this partial overlap between these two niches, then evolutionarily over time, those two species will tend to, through natural selection, they'll tend to gravitate towards separate niches, right? So we have the species that eat small mammals and birds, and the species that eat small mammals and fish. And over time, species B will gravitate towards eating more fish, and species A will gravitate towards eating more birds, because those are the areas where they're not having as much competition and they have more resources available. And so that's how that that kind of competition and the overlap of those niches can impact evolutionary changes. Right, so those species specialize into two separate niches. In some situations, though, you have a lot of overlap between the niches, right? So species A and species B, they might have a lot of factors in common that they need to survive, in which case there's going to be significant overlap between those two species. So very heavy competition will lead to competitive exclusion. That's that competitive exclusion principle that we just talked about, where if there's heavy enough competition in those niches, then one of those species will have to leave because they'll get outcompeted by the other species. And then you have a principle known as total exclusion, right? So in this case, species A has a large niche and it's more generalist, meaning that there are lots of different factors that can satisfy its needs. But within that niche, you might have species B, which has a smaller niche. It's more specialist, so it needs more specific conditions to exist for it to survive. So specialists tend to avoid competition, and meaning that they have evolved to only go after, like, let's say, one specific type of prey in that environment, which means that even though they're totally swamped by species A, they can still survive within that environment because they're such a specialist that they're only eating that one type of prey and they specialize in that. And the more generalist species has lots of different types of prey it might eat. And therefore they can coexist even though there's complete overlap of their niches, at least with regards to prey.
Scott?
Yes.
Do you have an example of that last total exclusion principle?
So an example of that, I guess, would be like along the lines of, like, if you're asking for an example of specific species that applies to, I don't have an example ready, but
or just anything to get my head around it a little better.
Yeah. So if we use the previous example, where let's say that you have two predators, right? And one prey will eat small mammals or birds or fish or other animals, insects even. right? And then species B will only eat insects. Species B has specialized in that niche to only eat insects. And so because there's less competition, because species A, they can eat any of those animals to get their nutrition. They don't have to eat insects. They might be willing to eat insects, but they don't have to eat insects. And so species B can coexist with species A because species B is eating all the insects and species A is like, that's fine. I'm not really into grubs anyway. I'll eat some small birds instead.
All right, thanks.
So that allows them to coexist, even though technically the niche of species A is completely encompassing the niche of species B. All right, another important topic, and this is a really important topic when we start talking about landscape ecology, is what's known as island biogeography. And it is 10:43, so we're almost done. You know what? I'm going to save island biogeography for next week. So we will pick up here with our next lecture on Tuesday. And are there any other questions before we close this out?
Regarding to the ArcGIS, so you put the link on Canvas, right? About how to.
Yes.
The instructions on how to. So how about us that using MacBook? Is there any?
Sorry, say that again.
So it's for the Microsoft, right? I mean, like for the Windows.
It's for Windows, yeah.
Yeah. How about MacBook?
So yeah, there is no version for Mac. So if you're on a Mac, your options are either you can log in remotely using the VDI, the virtual desktop infrastructure. There's instructions for how to use that also on Canvas, or you can install a dual boot system so that, like, for example, Parallels is a program that lets you install both the Mac operating system and the Windows operating system on your computer so that you can log into Windows and install ArcGIS that way. So those are kind of the two options: do a dual boot system on your computer, or just use VDI and log in remotely to use ArcGIS on one of the campus computers. Or physically, you can go to the computer lab at the library. The library computers have ArcGIS, or you can go to NESB and use the computers there.
If you install Windows on your Mac, you're gonna have to clear out a lot of your memory as well. Make sure there's like space in your
exactly.
Because that's what I have to do.
Yeah, you're gonna want a pretty decent sized hard drive to have enough space to install Windows and have space for ArcGIS to operate on there. So the easiest solution is if you have a Windows machine, that's the easiest. But if you already have a Mac, then those are your solutions. And if you have questions about actually how to get those dual boot systems up and running, then you can contact Ag Help Desk and they can help you out with that.
Scott, I had a question. So I'm in the market for a new computer for a desktop, and I was wondering what kind of specs I should be looking for. Like I'm trying to have one that I can use in professional practice eventually, hopefully, and not have to buy a new computer in 2 years. So I was wondering what kind of specs I should be looking for.
So there are two. So usually the way I go about that is I look at the most demanding piece of software that I'm going to be using, and I look for the specs for that software and then base my purchase on that. So there are two programs that you want to look at. One is ArcGIS Pro is one of the more demanding programs. So look at the specs that are required for ArcGIS Pro. And then I would also look at the specs required for Lumion. So Lumion is going to be a little bit more demanding in terms of the type of graphics card that you have to do kind of real-time rendering. So if you can meet all of the recommended specs for both Lumion and ArcGIS Pro, and you can find them on their respective product web pages, then you'll be in good shape for, that'll you know, your computer will become obsolete eventually, like that's just technology, but it'll at least extend the amount of time that you can use that machine for.
Okay, sounds good.
Yep.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, well, that's it for today. I hope you guys have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Take care,
Thanks.
everyone.
Scott.